We know that many of you come to these essays not just to sleep, but because during the day, your mind is too full, too noisy. That's why we create these pieces deep enough for you to feel nourished, yet gentle enough for you to let go. Tonight, we explore something that may disturb you even as it soothes you. Something that refuses to leave us alone even decades after its discovery. This is psychology for sleep, but it's also psychology for awakening to what we've been avoiding our entire lives. Imagine standing at the edge of a still lake just before dawn. The world is suspended in that threshold moment between night and day, between dreaming and waking. Mist rises from the water's surface like forgotten thoughts made visible. The air tastes of pine and damp earth, cool against your skin. Your breath makes small clouds in the cold. Somewhere distant, an owl gives its final call before surrendering the night to morning. You are the only witness to this transition, this liminal moment between darkness and light. You approach the water's edge and look down. Your reflection stares back, but something about it feels wrong. The face is yours, the same features, the same tired eyes, but there's something moving beneath the surface, something just out of focus. You lean closer, trying to see more clearly, and for just a moment, the reflection seems to look back at you with recognition that goes deeper than mere mirroring. It knows something you've forgotten, or perhaps something you've been trying to forget. This unsettling feeling, this sense of something familiar, yet foreign, staring back from the depths, is what Carl Jung's ideas evoke in us. They don't comfort us with easy answers. They don't promise that everything will be fine if we just think positively or practice gratitude. Instead, they haunt us. They return unbidden in moments of quiet. They whisper uncomfortable truths when we're trying to fall asleep. They suggest that the face we show the world is a mask, and beneath it lies something we've spent our entire lives running from. The word haunt itself is worth examining as we settle into the psychology for sleep. To haunt means to return repeatedly, without invitation to occupy a space against the will of its inhabitants, to make oneself persistently present in a way that cannot be ignored. Ghosts haunt houses. Memories haunt minds. And Jung's discoveries about human darkness haunt our collective consciousness, refusing to be exorcised by positive thinking, or spiritual bypassing, or any of the other methods we've invented to avoid looking at ourselves honestly. His ideas haunt us because they concern the parts of ourselves that we've tried to bury, to forget, to pretend never existed. He called this the shadow, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a psychological reality. Everything we've denied about ourselves, everything we've been told is unacceptable, everything we've split off from our conscious identity and hidden in the depths, hoping it would simply dissolve if we ignored it long enough. But the shadow doesn't dissolve. It waits, and it watches. And eventually it shows itself, usually at the moments we can least afford to see it. In our modern world, more than 60 years after Jung's death, his warnings have grown only more urgent. Every news cycle seems to prove him right about collective shadow projection. Every political crisis reveals populations who cannot see their own darkness, only the darkness in the opposing tribe. Every act of violence that shocks us carries the signature of shadow material erupting when it can no longer be contained. We've built a technological wonderland, connected the entire planet through screens and signals, created unprecedented wealth and comfort for billions. Yet, we've systematically ignored the psyche's underworld. We've treated the unconscious like superstition, dismissed depth, psychology as outdated, replaced self-examination with self-improvement, and wondered why we keep encountering the same problems in new forms. Jung saw this coming. In 1913, years before the First World War, he had visions of Europe drowning in blood. He thought he was going mad. Then August 1914 arrived, and the blood became literal. Millions dead, because nations projected their shadows onto neighboring nations, convinced that evil lived only across borders, never within their own hearts. The pattern hasn't changed. We've just gotten better at denying it. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, we invite you on a journey through why one man's deliberate descent into what looked like madness produced maps we still desperately need. We'll trace the path from his personal discoveries to their manifestation across cultures and centuries. We'll examine what science has confirmed about his intuitions. And finally, most uncomfortably, we'll turn those discoveries directly toward you, asking you to see your own participation in the patterns Jung described. This is psychology for sleep, but fair warning, it may wake you up before it lets you rest. It may show you things about yourself that you've successfully avoided seeing until now. It may make you uncomfortable in ways that no amount of deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation can soothe. But discomfort, Jung taught us, is often the beginning of transformation. The caterpillar probably doesn't enjoy dissolving in the chrysalis, but without that dissolution, there can be no butterfly. So settle in. Allow your body to find its position of rest. Let your mind prepare for a long, slow exploration of territories most people spend their lives avoiding. We'll begin with Jung's foundational discovery, what he found when he stopped running from his own darkness and turned to face it directly. From there, we'll spiral outward and deeper, seeing how the same patterns appear in myths and fairy tales, how science has validated what seemed like mysticism, and finally, how all of this applies to the life you're living right now. The lake's surface still beckons. The reflection still waits. And beneath it, in the depths you've been afraid to explore, lies everything you've been looking for in all the wrong places. Let us descend together. We begin with a concept that has entered everyday language, but lost its true meaning in the process. People now casually refer to their shadow side, or doing shadow work, without fully grasping what Jung actually discovered. This is psychology for sleep that requires we first clear away the misconceptions before we can see the reality underneath. The shadow, in Jung's precise psychological terminology, is not evil. It's not your dark side in some moral sense, though it may contain what you consider dark. It's not the Freudian ID, that seething cauldron of primitive impulses. And it's crucially not the same as moral weakness or character flaws. The shadow is quite simply your unlived life. It is everything you could have been, but denied. Every quality you possessed but rejected. Every impulse you felt but suppressed. Every aspect of your personality that you learned was unacceptable, and therefore split off from your conscious identity and hid away in the unconscious. Let's frame this three ways. as Jung himself might have. Physically think of your actual shadow, the dark shape that follows you wherever you go, cast by light hitting your body. You cannot see it directly when it falls behind you. You can only see it when conditions allow, when you turn, when the angle of light shifts. And no matter how fast you run or how hard you try, you cannot escape it. It's connected to you by the simple fact that you exist and light exists. The psychological shadow works the same way. It's the necessary counterpart to your conscious identity, cast by the light of awareness hitting the totality of who you are. Temporally, the shadow is accumulated over your entire lifetime. It begins forming in early childhood, the moment you first hear no or don't, or good children don't do that. Every experience that taught you to hide parts of yourself added to the shadow. Every moment you swallowed anger to keep peace. Every time you suppressed joy because others might judge you. Every instance you denied your own needs to meet someone else's expectations. Year after year, the shadow grows, becoming a repository of everything you weren't allowed to be. Psychologically, the shadow functions as an autonomous complex. It has its own energy, its own agenda, its own will. This is what makes it different from simple repression. Repressed material sits passively in the unconscious. The shadow actively influences you. It appears in your dreams as threatening figures. It erupts in your projections onto others. It drives your sudden inexplicable reactions. It sabotages your conscious intentions. It has, in a very real sense, a life of its own. And here's why Jung's concept haunts us the more you try to be purely good, purely light, purely acceptable, the stronger and darker your shadow becomes. The spiritual person who denies all anger creates a shadow of pure rage. The rational person who denies all emotion creates a shadow of overwhelming feeling. The selfless person who never acknowledges their own needs creates a shadow of desperate, destructive neediness. This is the terrible paradox at the heart of human psychology. What we don't face becomes fate. What we try to eliminate through denial doesn't disappear. It goes underground, gathers strength, and eventually erupts in ways we cannot control. The shadow appears in dreams with disturbing regularity. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the ego's defenses relax, shadow figures emerge. The threatening stranger, the violent criminal, the sexual aggressor, the pathetic weakling. The aspects of yourself you've refused to acknowledge take form in your nighttime visions, trying desperately to get your attention. It appears in your projections, those moments when you have an inexplicably strong reaction to someone. The coworker who irritates you beyond all reason. The public figure you can't stop thinking about with contempt. The ex-partner you still rage about years later. Jung would ask, what quality in them are you refusing to see in yourself? And it appears in those sudden destructive impulses that seem to come from nowhere. The urge to say something cruel, the desire to sabotage your own success, the compulsion to ruin a good relationship. These aren't character flaws or moral failings. They're the shadow asserting itself, demanding integration, refusing to be ignored any longer. Jung's discovery of the shadow wasn't entirely new. What was new was a systematic psychological framework for understanding what humans had been observing for millennia. As we trace this history, let your mind relax into the rhythm of names and dates and ideas. This is psychology for sleep. After all, we're not here to memorize facts, but to feel the weight of human history grappling with the same darkness you carry. In the ancient Greek world, carved into the stone of the temple of Apollo at Delphi were two words: know thyself. This command, attributed to various sages, but universally recognized as foundational to Greek philosophy, wasn't a call to positive affirmation or self-esteem building. It was a warning. Socrates spent his life demonstrating that we don't know ourselves at all. We think we know what we believe, what we value, what we would do in difficult circumstances. Then life tests us, and we discover we're strangers to ourselves. Socrates himself reported a demon, an inner voice that would stop him from taking certain actions. Not a devil in the Christian sense, but an autonomous inner presence with its own knowledge and will. This is remarkably close to Jung's description of the shadow as an autonomous complex. The Greeks understood, even without modern psychological language, that we contain within us presences that are us, but not under our conscious control. Greek tragedy functioned as a cultural ritual for confronting shadow material. The tragic hero always fell because of hamartia, often translated as tragic flaw, but more accurately meaning missing the mark or error in judgment. Oedipus, desperately trying to avoid his fate, runs directly toward it. His very attempt to escape what he feared brought it about. This is the shadow's way. What we refuse to face consciously, we enact unconsciously. The Greeks knew this. They gathered annually to watch these stories, to witness what happens when humans remain blind to their own nature. In the medieval period, Christianity developed a complex shadow psychology, though they wouldn't have called it that. The Desert Fathers, those monks who retreated to the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd and 4th centuries, wrote extensively about wrestling with demons. These weren't metaphorical struggles. The monks experienced actual encounters with terrifying presences that tempted them, mocked them, assaulted them. Modern psychology recognizes these as externalized shadow encounters. The qualities the monks had renounced: sexuality, anger, pride, hunger for recognition, didn't disappear when they took monastic vows. Instead, these denied aspects took on autonomous existence in their psyches, appearing as demons precisely because the monk's conscious identity couldn't include them. St. Augustine's Confessions, written around 400 CE, is one of the first great psychological autobiographies in Western literature. Augustine writes with brutal honesty about his divided nature, wanting to be good, while being drawn to what he knew was destructive. His famous prayer, "Lord, make me chaste but not yet," reveals the shadow's influence perfectly. The conscious ego wants one thing, the shadow wants another, and often the shadow wins, at least temporarily. Medieval theology struggled with the problem of evil. If God is all good and all powerful, where does evil come from? The solution: they developed Satan as a fallen angel. The devil as God's adversary was psychologically necessary. A religion that defines God as pure light must create an equally powerful darkness to account for evil. Satan became Christianity's collective shadow, carrying everything the religion couldn't include in its image of the divine. The monastic tradition developed practices for confronting inner darkness: long silences, harsh penances, dark nights of the soul. While some of this was masochistic and psychologically damaging, the core insight remained valid. Transformation requires descending into darkness before ascending to light. As we enter the Renaissance and Enlightenment, The concept of the double appears with increasing frequency in European literature. The doppelganger, the German word for double walker, haunted German Romanticism. This was the uncanny experience of meeting your exact duplicate, which folklore said presaged death. Psychologically, seeing your double meant seeing the unlived life, the road not taken, the self you might have been. And this encounter was deadly to the ego, because it shattered the illusion that you were unified, consistent, knowable. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, became an instant sensation because it gave literary form to what everyone felt but couldn't articulate. The respectable doctor and the violent criminal weren't two people. They were one person split in two. Jekyll created a potion that would allow him to indulge his darker impulses without damaging his reputation. But the shadow, once given form and freedom, grew stronger. Eventually, Jekyll couldn't control the transformations. Hyde took over. The shadow became the master, and the conscious ego became the shadow. This is one of Jung's crucial warnings. Ignore the shadow long enough, deny it fiercely enough, and it doesn't disappear. It takes over. Fyodor Dostoevsky, writing in 19th century Russia, created characters who embodied shadow material with disturbing intensity. The double tells the story of a clerk who encounters his exact duplicate, but one who is more successful, more confident, more comfortable in the world. The original man goes mad watching his shadow self take over his life. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky gives us a narrator who lives entirely in his shadow. Bitter, resentful, self-destructive, unable to connect with others, yet brutally honest about human nature in ways polite society refused to acknowledge. The Romantic poets understood that creativity required descending into darkness. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan in an opium dream accessing material his conscious mind couldn't reach. William Blake saw visions his entire life communicated with angels, and demons insisted that imagination was more real than the material world. These weren't metaphors for the Romantics. They were direct experiences of the unconscious breaking through. As the 19th century progressed toward the 20th, philosophy began approaching what Jung would systematize. Friedrich Nietzsche commanded readers to become who you are, recognizing that most people live as strangers to their true nature. His concept of the Übermensch, usually translated as Superman or Overman, wasn't about domination, but about integration. The fully realized human being was one who had integrated all aspects of themselves, including what society deemed dark or dangerous. Arthur Schopenhauer posited the will as an unconscious driving force beneath rational consciousness. We think we're making recent choices, but beneath our awareness, the blind will pushes us toward survival, reproduction, and meaningless repetition. This anticipates Jung's understanding that consciousness floats on a vast unconscious sea. In France, Pierre Janet studied dissociation, the way traumatic experiences could split off from conscious awareness and form autonomous presences in the psyche. Janet's patients would have entire personalities they couldn't remember, experiences they'd blocked, impulses that seemed to come from nowhere. This clinical work validated what literature and philosophy had been suggesting. We are not unified. We contain multitudes, and many of those multitudes are hidden from our awareness. Then came Sigmund Freud. Jung initially saw Freud as a father figure, someone who'd finally brought scientific rigor to the study of the unconscious. Freud had discovered that symptoms had meaning, that dreams revealed hidden content, that the psyche operated according to discoverable laws. But Freud reduced everything to sexuality and childhood trauma. The unconscious in Freud's model was a garbage dump of repressed sexual desires and unacceptable aggressive impulses. It had no positive content, no creative potential, no wisdom. It was simply what civilized consciousness had to suppress to function in society. Jung couldn't accept this reduction. In his work at Berg-Hulsli Psychiatric Hospital, he encountered patients whose delusions and hallucinations contained mythological material they'd never studied. Schizophrenic patients described visions that matched ancient mystery religions. How could purely personal sexual trauma explain that Jung began collecting these parallels? The psychotic patients weren't just sick. They were drowning in the same archetypal patterns that mystics and visionaries had accessed throughout history. This suggested a layer of unconscious beneath the personal, what Jung would call the collective unconscious. The break with Freud was inevitable. It came in 1913 after Jung published Symbols of Transformation, arguing that libido wasn't just sexual energy, but psychic energy that could take many forms. Jung knew what this book would cost him. His entire professional circle was Freudian. Publishing it meant professional isolation, loss of colleagues, accusations of mental illness. He published it anyway. Better to lose everything than betray his own understanding. And what followed was the most important period of Jung's life, his deliberate descent into what looked like madness. In December 1913, Carl Jung sat at his desk in his house in Kusnacht and made a decision that would have destroyed most people. He would drop all psychological defenses and let the unconscious come. This wasn't passive surrender. This was active experimentation. Jung was a scientist studying the most dangerous substance in existence, his own psyche. He kept detailed records. He maintained his practice, seeing patients throughout this period. He held his family together. But every evening, he descended. He would sit quietly, release conscious control, and allow images to arise. At first, nothing. Then suddenly, he felt himself falling through darkness. His feet hit ground. He was in a cave. An old man with a white beard stood beside a beautiful young woman. The man introduced himself as Elijah. The woman was Salome. They had a companion, a large black serpent. These weren't metaphors Jung was creating. They appeared autonomously with their own personalities, their own knowledge. Elijah represented the wise old man, archetype, wisdom, spirit logos. Salome represented the anima soul, eros, the feminine principle in a man's psyche. The serpent was earthly wisdom instinct, the connection to nature. Jung learned to enter these visions consciously, what he called active imagination. He would converse with these figures, ask questions, receive answers that surprised him. This wasn't dissociation or psychosis. He maintained awareness that these were contents of his own psyche. But they operated autonomously with knowledge that his conscious ego didn't possess. Another figure appeared, Philemon, an old man with kingfisher wings. Philemon became Jung's primary guide through the unconscious territories. He taught Jung that thoughts weren't things you made, but things that happened to you. The psyche had its own objective existence, independent of conscious will. Every evening for years, Jung descended into these visions. The material was overwhelming: mythological figures, geometric patterns, scenes of ritual and transformation. He wrote everything in journals that he later transcribed into what became the Red Book, a massive leather-bound volume that Jung kept private his entire life, considering it too personal, too raw. This work was terrifying. Jung had to develop techniques to stay grounded. He saw patients. He carved stone. He sailed his boat on Lake Zurich. His family became his anchor to consensus reality. Emma watched her husband disappear into his study each night, heard him talking to invisible presences, saw him painting bizarre images. She could have had him committed. Instead, she held the household together, understanding from inside what those years cost. The most humiliating moment came when inner voices commanded him to play. A grown man, a respected doctor, building little cities with stones on the lakeshore. But Jung obeyed. As he built, memories surfaced. Childhood games, forgotten dreams. The play reconnected him to the creative force that exists before rational thought. This was individuation, the process of becoming whole, not rising above the primitive, but integrating it, not transcending the body, but embodying the spirit, not eliminating the shadow, but befriending it. Jung understood that what he was discovering had to be grounded at both his own experience and universal patterns. The personal shadow, his specific unlived life, his individual denied qualities, was nested within a collective shadow containing humanity's shared darkness. What emerged from this period was a psychology that could account for both the heights and depths of human experience. Not just pathology, but creativity. Not just neurosis, but mystical vision. Not just personal history, but archetypal patterns running through all of human culture. Now we arrive at the practical question that matters most for psychology, for sleep, and psychology for living. What happens when you actually face your shadow? What are the benefits of this terrifying work? Jung identified multiple functions of shadow integration, each crucial for psychological wholeness. Let's examine them one by one, allowing your mind to drift through these insights as your body settles deeper into rest. This may be the most immediately transformative aspect of shadow work. When you hate someone intensely, Jung asks you to check your shadow. When someone irritates you beyond all proportion to their actual offense, examine what you are seeing. What you condemn in others is almost always what you've disowned in yourself. The qualities that trigger the strongest reactions are the qualities living in your shadow. This is what Jung called the psychological rule we can only recognize in others, what exists somewhere in ourselves. Research in social psychology has confirmed this repeatedly. Studies on confirmation bias show that when we've split off certain qualities from our conscious identity, we become hypervigilant for those qualities in others. We're essentially projecting our own shadow material onto external screens, other people, so we can see it without having to acknowledge it as ours. There's a story of a therapist who couldn't stop judging a client's anger. Every session she found herself becoming irritated by the client's rage, thinking she needs to control herself. She needs to stop being so aggressive. Finally, the therapist's supervisor asked, "What are you not allowing yourself to feel?" The therapist broke down. She'd spent her entire life suppressing her own anger, being the good girl, the peacemaker, the calm one. Her client's rage was showing her the volcano she'd been sitting on for decades. Once she owned her own capacity for anger, not acting it out destructively, but acknowledging it existed, her reaction to the client completely shifted. She could now help the client work with anger instead of unconsciously trying to eliminate it. This is projection withdrawal. You stop seeing your shadow in other people and start seeing it in yourself. And paradoxically, this makes you far less judgmental. When you've acknowledged your own capacity for cruelty, selfishness, weakness, stupidity, when you've truly owned these as possibilities within yourself, you stop being shocked when you see them in others. You become, in Jung's language, capable of compassion. Not the shallow compassion of pity, but the deep compassion of recognizing shared humanity, shared struggle, shared darkness. Repression requires enormous amounts of psychic energy. Every moment, you're maintaining your persona. The mask. You show the world you're using energy to keep the shadow hidden. Every time you swallow your actual feelings to maintain a false image, you're burning fuel. Think of it like holding a beach ball underwater. The deeper you push it down, the more force required to keep it there. At first, it's manageable, but over time, holding that ball submerged takes all your strength. You're exhausted from the effort, but you can't remember why, because you're not consciously aware of what you're repressing. Shadow integration is like releasing that beach ball. Suddenly, all that energy becomes available for other purposes. Studies on authenticity and vitality consistently show that people who live more authentically, who don't maintain large gaps between their public and private selves, report higher energy levels, greater creativity, more resilience to stress. One example, a minister who'd spent 40 years preaching a faith he'd lost. He maintained the sermons, the prayers, the pastoral care, all while secretly doubting everything he taught. The energy required to maintain this split was crushing him. Depression, insomnia, psychosomatic symptoms. When he finally left the church and owned his doubts publicly, something unexpected happened. He didn't become bitter or nihilistic. Instead, he became more spiritually alive than he'd ever been. He could explore questions honestly, instead of defending answers he didn't believe. The energy that had gone into repression became available for genuine seeking. This doesn't mean shadow integration makes you lazy or complacent. It means you stop using energy to fight yourself and start using it to engage with life. Here's a pattern you may recognize. You keep finding the same person in different bodies, different names, different faces, but the same essential dynamic plays out. The unavailable partner, the critical parent, the demanding friend, the competitive colleague. You tell yourself you're just unlucky in relationships. But Jung would ask, who's doing the choosing? What we call chemistry or attraction is often recognition, not of a soulmate, but of someone who carries qualities from our shadow. We're attracted to people who express what we've denied. The partner who's comfortable with anger when we're not. The partner who's confidently selfish when we've been trained to be selfless. The partner who's openly vulnerable when we've learned to hide all weakness. At first, we admire these qualities. He's so passionate, translation, angry in ways I can't be. She's so independent, translation, selfish in ways I forbid myself. But slowly, predictably, we begin to hate them for the exact qualities we initially loved. Because they're showing us our shadow, and instead of integrating it ourselves, we try to change them. The bargain is unconscious, but clear. If I can fix them, I won't have to face myself. But they don't change. Or, if they do change, we lose interest because they're no longer carrying our projection. Then we find someone else with a variation of the same shadow material, and the cycle continues. Shadow work breaks this pattern. When you've integrated your own anger, you stop being attracted to people who will act it out for you. When you've owned your own neediness, you stop finding partners who are overly dependent. When you've acknowledged your own capacity for cruelty, you stop choosing people who will abuse you so you can feel morally superior as the victim. Relationships become clearer, simpler, more honest. You can see the actual person instead of your projection. And paradoxically, this makes real intimacy possible for the first time. There's a crucial difference between naive goodness and conscious choice. The person who's never examined their capacity for evil and chooses good because they think they're incapable of evil, that's naive goodness. The person who's looked directly at their own potential for cruelty and still chooses compassion, that's moral maturity. Jung understood this from studying the Holocaust. How did ordinary Germans, educated, cultured, many of them, Christian, participate in or ignore industrial-scale genocide? How did the nation of Goethe and Beethoven produce Auschwitz? His answer: they'd never examined their own shadows. They believed they were good people, incapable of such evil. Therefore, when evil impulses arose, they didn't recognize them. They rationalized them, reframed them, called them duty or loyalty or necessary sacrifice. The German who'd spent his life being a good citizen, following rules, respecting authority, he had a massive shadow of violence and cruelty that he'd never acknowledged. When the culture gave permission for that shadow to emerge disguised as patriotic duty, it erupted with catastrophic force. Post-conventional morality, as developmental psychologists call it, requires shadow awareness. You can't make truly ethical choices if you don't understand your own capacity for the unethical. You can't be trustworthy if you don't know your own potential for betrayal. Shadow integration doesn't make you more likely to do evil. It makes you less likely because you're no longer unconsciously enacting it while telling yourself you're good. The person who knows they could steal is far less likely to steal than the person who believes they're incapable of theft, because the first person is watching themselves. The second person isn't. Artists have always known this intuitively. The creative impulse comes from the shadow, the negative emotions you've been taught to suppress or eliminate: rage, envy, lust, grief, despair. These are precisely what fuel great art writing music. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, and there is no great creative work without descent into shadow material." The artist who only expresses socially acceptable emotions produces shallow work. The writer who won't explore their own darkness creates forgettable stories. The musician who avoids pain makes elevator music. Consider how many writers describe their best work emerging from their worst periods: depressed, grieving, enraged, heartbroken. Not despite these states, but because of them. The shadow material demanded expression, and art became the channel. One example: a writer who'd been blocked for months. She couldn't write, didn't want to write. Every attempt felt forced and dead. Finally, her therapist asked, What are you feeling that you won't let yourself feel? Envy. Pure corrosive envy of other writers' success. She was ashamed of this feeling, tried to eliminate it with affirmations and gratitude practices. But the envy wouldn't go away because it was shadow material, demanding acknowledgement. Once she owned the envy, wrote about it, honestly, let herself feel it fully without judgment, her block dissolved. The energy that had gone into repressing the envy became available for writing, and her work became deeper, more honest, more alive. This is why Jung insisted that shadow work wasn't self-improvement, it was transformation. And transformation always required going down before going up. Here we arrive at perhaps the most important function of shadow work, especially for our moment in history. Each individual who integrates their shadow reduces the likelihood of collective possession by shadow material. Jung watched Europe descend into 2 world wars because nations couldn't face their own shadows. Each country projected its darkness onto neighboring countries, convinced that evil existed only across borders. Germany blamed France. France blamed Germany. Both blamed Jews or communists or whoever could carry the projection. Mass movements, fascism, communism, fundamentalism of any stripe work by offering populations someone to hate, someone onto whom they can project their shadow. The scapegoat mechanism is as old as human culture, but it becomes genocidal when combined with modern technology and mass media. Every person who withdraws their projections, who owns their shadow instead of projecting it, makes collective madness slightly less likely. Not because they've become morally superior, but because they're no longer unconsciously contributing to the collective shadow. This is how shadow work becomes political without being political activism. This is how personal transformation serves collective healing. One person at a time facing what they'd rather deny. One projection at a time being withdrawn. One judgment at a time being recognized as confession rather than observation. Jung believed this was the work of our time, not saving the world through grand gestures, but individuating sufficiently that we stop unconsciously destroying it. If you're still awake as we move through this psychology for sleep, you may be wondering, how does one actually do this work? What are the concrete practices? Jung offered several approaches, each suited to different temperaments and situations. Keep what might be called a judgment journal. Every day write down who you judged and why. What did they do that irritated you? What quality in them did you condemn? Then ask, where does this quality exist in me, even in embryonic form? Where have I done something similar, but rationalized it differently? Notice your at leasts, those phrases we use to maintain moral superiority. At least I'm not as selfish as them. At least I don't lie like they do. At least I'm trying. Every at least marks a boundary between conscious identity and shadow. Cross that boundary in your imagination. What would it be like to be as selfish as them? When have you lied in ways you didn't call lying? Track emotional overreactions. When your response to something is twice as intense as the situation warrants, shadow has been activated. Someone's minor mistake enrages you. Someone's success devastates you. Someone's habit disgusts you far beyond reason. These disproportionate reactions are signals pointing toward shadow material. Work with your dreams. Who appears as the villain in your dreams? The threatening figure, the pathetic weakling, the sexual aggressor. These are often shadow representations. Instead of dismissing them as just dreams, dialogue with these figures. Ask what they want, what they're trying to tell you, what part of you they represent. Active imagination. Jung's core technique requires more skill. You allow an image to arise from the unconscious, a figure, a scene, a situation. Then you engage with it consciously. You don't direct it like a fantasy. You participate as you would in a conversation with another person. The 3-2-1 shadow process, developed by Ken Wilber, offers a systematic approach. First, describe the person or quality you're judging in third person. He is selfish. Second, speak to them in second person. You are selfish, and here's how you affect me. Third, speak as them in first person. I am selfish because. This shift from observation to identification often reveals what you're projecting. Working with a therapist trained in depth psychology can provide container and guidance. Shadow work can be destabilizing. Having someone who's done their own shadow work and can recognize when you're avoiding versus when you're genuinely integrating makes enormous difference. Mirror work, literal and metaphorical. Stand before a mirror and ask, what don't I want to see? Not your physical appearance, but your psychological reality. What truth about yourself are you avoiding? What would you have to acknowledge if you were completely honest? Some people benefit from retreats focused explicitly on shadow work. Men's work or women's work gatherings that use ritual group process and guided exercises to bring shadow material to consciousness. These intensive experiences can catalyze years of change in days, though they require integration work afterward. Psychodrama or Gestalt empty chair techniques allow you to externalize and dialogue with different parts of yourself. You might speak as your shadow to your conscious ego, or as your inner critic to your creative self. Giving voice to rejected parts often reveals they're not as destructive or shameful as you feared. Dark retreats, literal time spent in complete darkness, can facilitate shadow encounters by removing external stimulation and forcing attention inward. Without light, without distraction, you meet what you've been avoiding. Crucial point. Shadow integration doesn't mean becoming your shadow. It doesn't mean acting out destructive impulses or abandoning ethical boundaries. It means acknowledging these impulses exist, understanding where they come from, and making conscious choices about them. There's a distinction between conscious evil and unconscious evil that matters enormously. Conscious evil is rare people who know they're doing harm and choose it anyway. Unconscious evil is common people who harm others while convinced they're doing good because they can't see their shadow operating through them. The parent who abuses their child while believing they're providing discipline. The leader who destroys lives while believing they're serving a higher cause. The friend who betrays you while convinced they're helping. All unconscious evil, all shadow material enacted without awareness. Shadow work makes unconscious evil conscious, which gives you choice. You can see the impulse arising to wound, to dominate, to diminish, and choose a different response. Not because you're morally superior, but because you're psychologically aware. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the work. Not eliminating darkness, but illuminating it. not transcending the shadow, but integrating it. For those drawn to go deeper into Jung's work on shadow, several texts stand as essential. Ion, published in 1951, traces the shadow of Western civilization across 2,000 years of Christian history. Jung shows how Christianity's insistence on God as pure light created an equal and opposite shadow that manifests as Satan, the Antichrist, the apocalyptic destruction. The book is dense, scholarly, and profoundly disturbing in its implications. Answer to Job, from 1952, is Jung's most controversial work. He argues that in the biblical book of Job, God reveals himself as unconscious, torturing his faithful servant to win a bet. This forces God toward consciousness, toward incarnation, toward becoming human in Christ. But the incarnation was incomplete because Christ was sinless, therefore not fully human. The real transformation comes through ordinary humans achieving consciousness. Reading this feels like watching someone commit theological dynamite in slow motion. Robert Johnson's Owning Your Own Shadow, published in 1991, offers the most accessible introduction to Jungian shadow work. Short, practical, with clear examples and exercises. If you want to understand shadow without drowning in Jung's complex Germanic prose, start here. Marie-Louise von Francis, Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales, from 1974, shows how shadow appears in folklore worldwide. Von Franz was Jung's closest collaborator, and she demonstrates how tales like Snow White Hansel and Gretel and Bluebeard encode shadow wisdom in narrative form. Finally, Meeting the Shadow, a 1991 anthology edited by Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams, gathers essential writings on shadow from Jung, his followers, and modern depth psychologists. It's comprehensive without being overwhelming, scholarly without being inaccessible. Before we leave this foundational pillar and move deeper, we must address the dangers inherent in shadow work. This is psychology for sleep, yes, but it's also psychology that can wake you up in ways you're not prepared for. Some people, upon discovering their shadow, make a new identity out of it. They were too nice, so they become brutally honest. They were too controlled, so they become wildly spontaneous. They were too rational, so they become deeply intuitive. This is just trading one persona for another. The dark spiritual seeker, who's above all that mainstream superficiality, is still wearing a mask, just a different mask. True integration means you can access both poles as needed, not that you identify with one side against the other. Example: someone who spent years being the agreeable people pleaser discovers their shadow contains aggression and boundary setting. Good, healthy, necessary. But if they become the person who prides themselves on not taking shit from anyone, who's brutally honest, as their new identity, they've just created a new persona with its own shadow. Now their shadow contains all their suppressed gentleness, all their denied need for connection, all their disowned desire to be liked. I'm just owning my darkness becomes rationalization for harming others. I'm integrating my shadow becomes permission to act out destructive impulses without consequence. This is shadow work in name only. True shadow work makes you more responsible, not less. More aware of your impact, not less. More capable of genuine remorse, not less. If your shadow work leaves a trail of damaged relationships and hurt people, while you congratulate yourself for being authentic, you're not integrating, you're acting out. The distinction Jung made conscious choice versus unconscious compulsion. When you've integrated your shadow, you can choose when and how to express anger, when to set boundaries, when to prioritize yourself. The key word is choice. When you're possessed by shadow, there is no choice, only impulsive reaction that you rationalize afterward. Shadow work requires ego strength. You need a stable sense of self before you can safely examine what threatens that self. Someone in crisis, recently traumatized, actively addicted, psychologically fragmented, may not have the structural stability for deep shadow work. This is why traditional depth analysis often begins with years of regular therapy before descending into the unconscious. You need to know where home base is before you venture into the wilderness. You need an anchor before you dive to the depths. Some people need to strengthen their boundaries before they can examine shadow material about boundaries. Some need to develop basic self-worth before they can face their grandiosity. The therapist's job is assessing readiness, not pushing everyone toward the deepest work, regardless of where they are. Perhaps the most subtle danger, believing you've completed shadow work and are now enlightened beyond the masses who remain unconscious. This is spiritual inflation, wearing psychological language. Shadow work is never finished. Each life stage brings new shadow material. Each transition reveals new, denied aspects. Each achievement brings shadow elements of that achievement. The shadow is like a spiral staircase you descend. You keep encountering familiar themes, but always from a different level. The person who's arrogant about their self-knowledge has massive shadow around their ignorance and uncertainty. The person who believes they've transcended judgment has massive shadow around their judgmental nature. The person convinced they're fully individuated has just created the shadow of someone still deeply conditioned. True shadow integration makes you humbler, not prouder, more uncertain about others, not more certain, less likely to teach unsolicited lessons, not more likely. If your shadow work has made you feel superior to those who haven't done the work, congratulations, you've just identified your shadow. We've established the foundation. Now what the shadow is, how it forms, why it matters, how it can be approached. We've seen that Jung didn't invent this concept, but gave systematic form to what humanity has always known. But understanding shadow psychologically is only the first spiral. Jung's discovery went deeper. He found that these patterns weren't merely personal neuroses unique to each individual. They were archetypal forms that appeared across cultures throughout history, in every mythology and fairy tale and sacred text. The shadow he discovered had 1,000 faces. It wore different masks in different eras, different cultures, different stories. But beneath the masks, the same essential pattern persisted. As you allow yourself to drift deeper into the psychology for sleep, we're about to enter the archetypal dimension. We're moving from the personal shadow, your specific unlived life, to the collective shadow patterns that haunt entire civilizations. From Jung's individual descent, we now spiral outward to see how that same descent has been mapped by myth, ritual, and story since humans first gathered around fires to share what they'd encountered in darkness. The shadow is waiting in the next layer, wearing its ancient faces, telling its eternal stories, showing us that what feels uniquely personal is actually universally human. Let us continue the descent together. Carl Jung's crucial insight, the one that separated him permanently from Freud, was that beneath the personal unconscious lies a collective unconscious. This wasn't metaphor or speculation. Jung encountered this empirically through his patients, his own visions, and his decades of studying comparative mythology and religion. The collective unconscious contains what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that appear across all cultures, all times, all individuals. These aren't ideas or concepts. They're psychological structures, forms that shape how humans perceive and experience reality. Think of archetypes as channels that water must flow through. The water, the specific content varies by culture and individual, but the channels themselves are the same for everyone. Birth and death, mother and father, hero and monster, light and shadow. The shadow exists as both personal and archetypal. Your personal shadow contains your specific denied qualities formed by your unique life history. But nested within that is the archetypal shadow, the universal human experience of denying parts of ourselves to maintain social identity. In Jungian psychology, several archetypes work together to create the full personality. The persona is the mask we show the world, our social role, our public identity. The shadow is the inverse of the persona, everything we've had to deny to maintain that public face. The anima in men, or animus in women, represents the contrasexual aspects of psyche. The self represents the totality of psyche, the center and circumference of psychological wholeness. These aren't compartments or separate entities. They're different aspects of one integrated system, but they can become split off from each other, creating the fragmentations we experience as neurosis, compulsion, or meaninglessness. The shadow as archetype appears in dreams with remarkable consistency. For men, it usually appears as a same-sex figure, often threatening or criminal or violently energetic. For women, similar, a same-sex figure carrying qualities the dreamer has disowned. The shadow figure knows things the conscious ego doesn't. Acts with freedom the ego can't access. Possesses qualities the ego has rejected. One related archetype deserves special attention in understanding shadow, the trickster. Found in virtually every culture, the trickster is neither good nor evil, but disruptive. Coyote in Native American mythology, Loki in Norse tales, Anansi the spider in West African and Caribbean folklore, Hermes in Greek tradition. These figures violate boundaries, mock authority, reveal hypocrisy, cause chaos, and through that, chaos, force transformation. The trickster represents shadow energy in its most creative form. It disrupts established order, not from malice, but from the archetypal necessity of keeping life dynamic. When systems become too rigid, too controlled, too certain of their own righteousness, the trickster arrives to shatter that certainty. In modern culture, we see trickster energy in figures like the Joker in Batman, or Tyler Durden in Fight Club, or Deadpool in Marvel Comics. These characters disturb us because they represent what we've repressed: chaos, violence, disregard for rules. But they also fascinate us because they act with freedom. We've sacrificed for security. Another archetypal form related to shadow is the doppelganger. The double, the exact replica of yourself that appears as separate. European folklore treated encountering your double as a death omen. Psychologically, the doppelganger represents the unlived life, walking beside you, the person you might have been if you'd made different choices, chosen different values. followed different paths. The terror of the doppelganger comes from recognizing that our conscious identity, the story we tell about who we are, is just one possibility among many. The shadow contains all those other possibilities we denied. And sometimes that shadow becomes autonomous enough that it feels like a separate presence stalking us, living the life we rejected. This is psychology for sleep, becoming psychology of the deepest questions. What if everything you think you are is arbitrary? What if the essential you could have manifested in completely different forms? What if the person you're most afraid of becoming is actually yourself from an alternate timeline? Mythology functions as humanity's collective dream. The same patterns Jung found in individual analysis appear in myths worldwide. Let's examine how different cultures have encoded shadow wisdom in their stories. The Greeks understood human nature as containing two opposing forces, personified as two gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo represented light, reason, order, form, clarity, boundaries, civilization. He was the god of the sun, music, prophecy, healing. Apollonian consciousness is what we value in Western culture. Rational thought, clear distinctions, organized systems, measurable progress. Dionysus represented darkness, ecstasy, chaos, dissolution, intoxication, wildness, nature. He was the god of wine, of madness, of the theater. Dionysian consciousness is what we fear: loss of control, merger with others, destruction of boundaries, surrender to forces beyond reason. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the 19th century, recognized that Greek culture held these opposites in tension. Greek tragedy was a ritual for experiencing Dionysian energy within Apollonian form. The plays depicted terrible fates, violent emotions, boundaries violated, but contained within the structure of theater, witnessed by the community, processed through art. Modern Western culture has become almost purely Apollonian. We value control, reason, productivity, order. We fear anything, Dionysian. We medicate ecstasy, pathologize wildness, eliminate chaos. Our shadow, therefore, has become Dionysian to an extreme degree. This explains the epidemic of addiction, the explosion of mass shootings, the appeal of apocalyptic fantasies. The Dionysian shadow returns when suppressed too long. It erupts in addiction to substances that force ecstasy and dissolution. It manifests in violence that destroys boundaries and order. It appears in entertainment that depicts civilization's collapse. The Greek wisdom we've forgotten. Both gods are necessary. Pure Apollo becomes sterile, rigid, dead. Pure Dionysus becomes chaotic, destructive, mad. Health requires holding both in creative tension. Christianity created perhaps the most extreme light-dark split in Western religious history. Christ is presented as sinless, pure light, God incarnate with no shadow. Satan is absolute darkness, the father of lies, pure evil. Jung saw this as psychologically catastrophic. When your God image contains only light, you must create an equally powerful, dark figure to account for evil. Christianity needed Satan not as a real being, but as a psychological necessity. Everything that couldn't be included in the image of Christ had to go somewhere. The problem intensifies when believers try to imitate Christ's sinlessness. The Christian who strives to be pure, holy, without sin creates a massive shadow. All their anger, sexuality, doubt, selfishness, cruelty, everything human gets split off and projected. Historically, this projection fell on Jews, pagans, heretics, witches, whoever could be labeled as serving Satan became the carrier of Christianity's collective shadow. The torture chambers of the Inquisition, the burning of witches, the pogroms, all shadow eruptions from a religion that defined God as pure light. Jung's answer to Job argues that the incarnation was God's attempt to become conscious of his own shadow. By becoming human in Christ, God entered the realm of suffering and limitation. But Christ's sinlessness meant the integration remained incomplete. The shadow of Christianity, the Antichrist, the apocalypse, the final destruction, still awaits in Revelation. Yeah, modern evangelical Christianity often exemplifies this split. The emphasis on being saved, being righteous, being separate from the world creates massive shadow. The purity culture movement that shames sexuality, the prosperity gospel that baptizes greed, the political alliances that baptize nationalism and racism, all unconscious shadow eruptions from people convinced they're serving pure light. The Brothers Grimm collected fairy tales that had circulated orally for centuries, encoding psychological wisdom in narrative form. Snow White is particularly revealing about feminine shadow. Snow White is presented as pure beauty, pure innocence, pure goodness. She's passive, doesn't express anger, serves the dwarfs willingly, trusts the disguised queen repeatedly, despite warnings. The evil queen is her shadow opposite, vain, jealous, competitive murderess. She cannot tolerate Snow White's beauty because she's identified her entire worth with being the fairest of all. Psychologically, these aren't two women. They're two aspects of one psyche. The feminine ego that's been trained to be beautiful, good, selfless, passive, and the shadow that contains all the denied qualities: vanity, competitiveness, rage, sexuality, power. The Queen's three attempts to kill Snow White use increasingly intimate methods. First, laces drawn too tight, constriction of breath of life. Second, a poisoned comb, vanity as self-destruction. Third, the poisoned apple, the forbidden fruit knowledge of good and evil sexuality. Snow White falls into death sleep when she bites the apple. She's in stasis, preserved in glass, neither alive nor dead. This is what happens when we can't integrate our shadow, psychological deadness, while maintaining the appearance of life. The beautiful corpse in the glass coffin, the prince's kiss, awakens her. In fairy tale language, this represents integration, the union of masculine and feminine consciousness, and unconscious ego and shadow. But most versions skip over the queen's fate. In some early versions, she's forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies. This is shadow punishment, making conscious what was unconscious, which burns. Modern young women live this tale daily. The cultural demand to be beautiful, but not vain, sexual, but not slutty, powerful, but not threatening, successful, but not competitive. Every quality in that shadow demands expression. When it can't be integrated consciously, it emerges as eating disorders, depression, self-harm, or the queen's fate. A life consumed by comparison and competition. Less known than Disney fairy tales, but psychologically precise. Anderson's story, The Shadow, depicts exactly what happens when shadow is denied too long. A learned man in a hot country notices his shadow, detaches, and enters a house across the street. The shadow disappears. Years later, the shadow returns, now clothed, cultured, successful. It's been living its own life, while the man grew pale and sickly from excessive study. The shadow proposes they travel together, with the shadow playing master and the man playing servant. The man needing money agrees. The shadow becomes increasingly powerful, admired by society, engaged to a princess. The man protests that this is backwards, he's the real person. The shadow is just his shadow. The shadow's solution: kill the master. On the wedding day, the man is executed, and the shadow marries the princess. This is Jung's warning in narrative form. Neglect your shadow long enough, deny it fiercely enough, and it doesn't disappear, it takes over. What you refuse to acknowledge consciously becomes your master unconsciously. The scholar who lived entirely in his head, neglecting his body, his emotions, his instincts, his shadow literally walked away and lived the embodied life he denied. When he tried to reclaim primacy, it was too late. The shadow had become more real than the man. Literature has always been a vehicle for psychological truth that can't be stated directly. Let's examine how several writers across centuries explored shadow with remarkable precision. Written in the early 14th century, Dante's Inferno presents the descent into hell as a journey through increasingly severe punishments for sin. But reading it psychologically, it's a map of shadow integration. Dante must go down before he can go up. He must journey through every layer of denied impulse, every form of vice, every manifestation of evil, before he can reach purgatory, and eventually paradise. Virgil, the classical poet, serves as his guide, representing reason and human wisdom accompanying the journey into darkness. Each circle of hell represents different shadow material: the lustful, the gluttonous, the greedy, the wrathful, the heretics, the violent, the fraudulent, the treacherous. Dante encounters people he knew in life now trapped in eternal punishment for qualities he denied in himself. The key moment comes when Dante meets Paolo and Francesca, lovers condemned to hell for adultery. He's so moved by their story that he faints. He's encountering the shadow of illicit passion, recognizing its reality and tragedy, unable to maintain detached judgment. This is the work of shadow integration, descending into each denied realm, meeting it, directly being affected by it. Not condoning it, but acknowledging its existence and its human dimension. The journey's geography matters. Hell is structured as a giant pit descending toward Earth's center, where Satan is trapped in ice, frozen in place by his own coldness. The coldest circle isn't for passion or violence, but for betrayal, the complete absence of warmth, connection, love. Psychologically brilliant. The deepest shadow isn't hot rage or wild lust. It's cold detachment, the inability to connect, the betrayal of bonds. This is what happens when we've denied our need for others, our vulnerability, our capacity for genuine relationship. To reach paradise, Dante must first reach hell's bottom, must face the frozen Satan, must see the ultimate consequence of shadow denied and projected. Only then can he begin ascending. This is psychology for sleep that becomes psychology for transformation. You cannot transcend what you haven't first descended through. Published in 1886, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde became an instant cultural phenomenon because it gave form to what Victorian society was desperately trying to deny. Victorian England emphasized propriety, self-control, moral rectitude, social appearances. Everything unacceptable, sexuality, violence, selfishness, pleasure had to be suppressed. The collective shadow was enormous. Dr. Jekyll is the respectable professional, well-regarded physician, upstanding citizen, committed to good works. But he becomes fascinated with the duality of human nature, how man is not truly one, but truly two. He creates a potion that allows him to separate his acceptable self from his unacceptable self. As Hyde, he indulges every denied impulse, violence, cruelty, sexual misconduct implied, but not stated, in the Victorian text. Hyde is described as smaller than Jekyll, ape-like primitive. He's the evolutionary past, the animal nature that civilization supposedly transcended. At first, Jekyll can control the transformations. He drinks the potion, becomes Hyde, indulges his shadow, drinks the antidote, returns to Jekyll. Perfect system for shadow expression without social consequence. But the shadow grows stronger. The transformations begin happening spontaneously. Jekyll falls asleep and wakes as Hyde. He needs larger and larger doses to maintain his Jekyll persona. Finally, he runs out of the original ingredients. The shadow has become permanent. In desperation, Jekyll writes his confession and commits suicide, knowing that without the potion, he'll remain Hyde forever. The Victorian reader was meant to be horrified. But the horror isn't that Hyde exists. It's that Jekyll couldn't integrate him. Hyde isn't inherently evil. He's natural impulses given free rein, without conscience or restraint. What makes him monstrous is the split itself, the complete separation of shadow from consciousness. Modern readers might notice that Jekyll's solution, trying to quarantine his shadow in an alternate identity, is exactly what we do with social media, personas, secret lives, compartmentalized behaviors. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. That's just my online personality. That's not the real me. But the shadow always grows stronger when split off. And eventually, the transformations become involuntary. Joseph Conrad's 1899 novella uses a journey up the Congo River as metaphor for descent into the unconscious. Marlowe, the narrator, travels deeper into the African interior to find Kurtz, a European ivory trader who has gone native. The story operates on multiple shadow levels. There's the personal shadow, Kurtz's descent from civilized ideals to savage brutality. There's the cultural shadow, European colonialism's projection of its own darkness onto Africa and Africans. And there's the existential shadow, the recognition that civilization is a thin veneer over chaos. Kurtz represents what happens when a European leaves the constraints of his culture. He was sent to Africa to spread civilization and profit. Instead, he became worse than the savages he was meant to civilize. He set himself up as a god, conducted mysterious rituals, decorated his compound with severed heads. His famous final words, the horror, represent the recognition of what lies beneath the civilized mask. Jung would later analyze this phenomenon. Europeans in colonial Africa often experienced psychological disintegration because they'd projected all their shadow material onto Africans. When they lived among those projections without European social constraints, the shadow overwhelmed them. Conrad, to his credit, recognized that the heart of darkness wasn't Africa. It was the human psyche. Africa simply provided a blank screen onto which Europeans projected their shadow. The primitive violence they attributed to Africans was actually their own denied violence, made visible in a context where they could act it out while blaming the environment. This connects to Jung's crucial insight about colonialism. It creates a dangerous psychological situation. The colonizer projects their shadow onto the colonized, then either idealizes them as noble savages or demonizes them as primitive beasts. Neither response sees the actual people. Both are projections. Modern readers sometimes struggle with Conrad's racism, and the text is indeed saturated with racist assumptions. But it's also one of the earliest literary works to recognize colonialism as psychological catastrophe, not civilizing mission. The horror isn't what Europeans found in Africa. It's what they found in themselves when the social masks came off. Published in 1985, Blood Meridian depicts American expansion into the Southwest in the 1850s with unflinching violence. The novel contains no redemption, no moral center, no suggestion that civilization will triumph over savagery. The central figure is Judge Holden, a 7-foot-tall, hairless, almost albino man of enormous intelligence and casual brutality. He's educated, philosophical, cultured. He can discourse on geology, anthropology, languages, war. And he kills without hesitation, rapes children, collects specimens like a scientist, dances with grace. The judge represents pure shadow archetype. He's beyond good and evil. Or rather, he contains both so completely that moral categories become irrelevant. He tells the kid, the protagonist, war is God. Violence isn't aberration, but the fundamental reality of existence. McCarthy refuses to offer distance or comfort. The violence in the novel is described with the same attention to detail as the landscapes. Scalps are taken. Children are murdered. Women are raped. All described matter-of-factly as simple facts of frontier existence. This disturbs readers because McCarthy won't allow the usual escape routes. He won't condemn the violence from a position of moral superiority. He won't suggest these are exceptions to normal human nature. He won't promise that civilization eventually prevailed. He simply shows American expansion as shadow manifestation, violence, greed, cruelty, all operating under the banner of manifest destiny. The judge's final appearance is in a saloon years later. He's naked dancing, welcoming the kid. He says, "I'm here. I've always been here." The shadow isn't something you overcome. It's something you carry until you die. And pretending it doesn't exist only makes it stronger. Reading McCarthy is the opposite of comfort in psychology for sleep. It's psychology that forces you awake, that refuses the easy consolations that says, this capacity for violence, for cruelty, for treating others as objects, this is in you too. Not because you're bad, but because you're human. The tarot functions as a symbolic system encoding psychological wisdom in images. Jung was fascinated by tarot, recognizing the archetypal patterns in the major arcana. Several cards directly address shadow material. The traditional image shows Baphomet, a horned, winged figure, combining human and animal features sitting on a throne. Two naked humans are chained to the throne, but the chains are loose. They could remove them at any time. This is the crucial insight: we're enslaved to shadow material by choice, not by force. The chains of addiction, compulsion, destructive patterns, they're all loose enough to remove. But we don't, because shadow possession provides something permission to act out the denied impulses, escape from responsibility, identity, and victimhood. The Devil card represents material attachment, yes, but more deeply, it represents identifying with your shadow instead of integrating it. The person who becomes their addiction, the person who defines themselves by their worst qualities, the person who's given up on transformation and accepted being controlled by unconscious forces. But the card also contains a message: those chains are loose. Freedom remains possible. Shadow work can still begin. Nothing is permanent except the refusal to look. Lightning strikes a tower. Its crown explodes. Figures fall from the top, plummeting toward Earth. The foundation remains, but the structure built on it is destroyed. This represents what happens when you've built your entire identity on lies, on persona, on denying shadow. Eventually, something strikes crisis confrontation, catastrophic failure, and the false structure collapses. The tower moment is terrifying. Everything you thought you were crumbles. People you thought were friends disappear. Beliefs you thought were solid reveal themselves as convenient fictions. The comfortable life you'd built comes apart. But the tower is necessary. Jung would call this nigredo the blackening, the dissolving, the death phase of transformation. The old self must be destroyed before the true self can emerge. Shadow material that's been denied too long will force its own recognition, usually through crisis. Modern manifestations being cancelled, being fired, being divorced, being diagnosed, being exposed. Any situation where the persona is stripped away and shadow revealed publicly. It feels like death. It is death of the false self. The card promises nothing about what comes after. Only that what was false must fall. What happens next depends on whether you use the crisis for integration or simply rebuild the same tower on the same flawed foundation. A path runs between two towers into the distance. A dog and a wolf howl at the moon. A crayfish emerges from water onto land. The moon itself has a face both illuminating and obscuring. This is the card of the shadow journey. The path between the towers represents the narrow way through unconscious territory. The dog and wolf represent tame and wild nature, aspects of self we've domesticated and aspects we've denied. The crayfish climbing from water to land represents the emergence of unconscious content. Water symbolizes the unconscious. Land symbolizes consciousness. Something is crossing the boundary, emerging from depths into awareness. But the moon's light is deceptive. Unlike the sun's clear illumination, the moon creates illusions, distortions, projections. In moonlight, you can't see clearly. You might mistake what you're seeing. You might project your fears onto neutral objects. This is the inherent difficulty of shadow work. You're trying to see what's been invisible. You're trying to make conscious what's been unconscious. But the first glimpses are always distorted, always mixed with projection and fantasy and fear. The moon card says the journey must be made, but it won't be clear. You'll be uncertain. You'll question what's real. You'll feel like you're going mad. This is normal. This is the process. Keep walking the path. A skeleton in armor rides a white horse. A flag with a white rose waves. The sun rises between two towers in the distance. Bodies lie beneath the horse's hooves. A king, a maiden, a child, a bishop. No one is exempt. Despite its name, the death card doesn't signify literal death. It represents transformation through complete ending. For something genuinely new to emerge, something old must genuinely die. In shadow work, this is the death of the false self, the persona you've maintained, the identity you've clung to, the story you've told about who you are. All of it must die for integration to occur. This terrifies us because we don't know who will be afterward. The familiar self, even if it's causing suffering, feels safer than the unknown self that might emerge. Better the devil you know than the transformation you don't. But the card shows the sun rising in the distance. Beyond death lies renewal. Not reincarnation of the same patterns, but genuine transformation into something that couldn't have existed without the death. Psychology for sleep becomes psychology for awakening. What in you needs to die? What persona are you clutching? What identity have you outgrown but refuse to release? The skeleton waits patiently. The death will come whether you consent or not. The only question is whether you'll resist it until it's forced upon you, or whether you'll consciously surrender what's already dying. Here we must address something. Many skip shadow work itself can become shadow. The spiritual seeker who identifies with being deep or palaware or doing the work has just created a new persona with its own shadow. Now their shadow contains all the superficiality, all the unconsciousness, all the denial they project onto others who haven't done their work. This is an extremely common trap. The person who discovers Jung or Buddhism or psychedelics or any transformative practice, they undergo genuine opening, genuine insight. Then they make an identity out of it. They become the awakened one among sleepers, the conscious one among the unconscious, the deep one among the shallow. This is just ego wearing spiritual costume. It's persona in a new form, and it creates shadow as surely as any conventional identity. The tell is in the judgment. If your shadow work has made you more judgmental of others who haven't done the work, you haven't done the work. Real shadow integration makes you more humble, not less. More uncertain about your own self-knowledge, not more certain. Less interested in teaching others, not more interested. Another shadow manifestation, romanticizing darkness. The person who gets fascinated with their shadow and makes it an aesthetic. The tortured artist. The dark seeker. The one who's comfortable with my darkness as a badge of honor. This isn't integration. It's identification with shadow instead of integration of shadow. You've just flipped from identifying with light to identifying with darkness. Neither position represents wholeness. True integration means you can access both. You can be light and dark depending on what the situation requires. You're not attached to being either one. You've simply included both in a larger identity. A third shadow trap using psychological concepts as weapons. You're projecting. That's your shadow. You haven't done your work. These become ways to dismiss others' legitimate concerns, to deflect accountability, to maintain superiority. If someone gives you feedback and your response is, "That's just your projection," you might be right, or you might be avoiding genuine reflection. The person doing real shadow work considers, what if they're right? What if this is my blind spot? What if their criticism, even if harsh, contains truth I need to hear? The final trap, the arrogance of assuming you can see others' shadows clearly while they can't see yours. This is shadow projection, about shadow projection, meta shadow. You're absolutely convinced you understand others' unconscious motivations while remaining blind to your own. Jung's rule remains. We can only recognize in others what exists in ourselves. If you can clearly see someone's shadow, congratulations, you've just identified material in your own shadow. Use that awareness to examine yourself, not to judge them. The archetypal patterns don't disappear in modern culture. They simply wear contemporary clothing. Let's examine how shadow manifests in current forms. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram function as collective shadow projectors. The anonymity or distance of online interaction remove social constraints. People express rage, cruelty, and judgment they'd never display face to face. Comment sections become repositories for collective shadow. The viciousness directed at public figures, the pile-ons when someone makes a mistake, the gleeful destruction of reputations, all shadow eruption given digital form. But it's not just the negative comments. It's also the personas we construct, the curated life we present, the version of ourselves designed to attract likes and followers. Each carefully edited post creates more shadow material, everything we're actually experiencing, but not showing all the messiness we're hiding. Cancel culture operates as modern scapegoating ritual. The group identifies someone who's violated norms, projects all collective shadow onto that person, then enacts ritual destruction. It's the same mechanism that drove witch trials, but accelerated and amplified by digital technology. The person being cancelled becomes the carrier of everyone's guilt about the same or similar transgressions. At least I'm not as bad as them becomes the unconscious mantra. The righteousness of the mob is proportional to the shadow they're refusing to face in themselves. American politics demonstrates Jung's shadow mechanisms perfectly. Each side sees the other as evil, stupid, dangerous. Neither side can acknowledge their own darkness because they're too busy projecting it onto the opposition. Conservatives see liberals as destroying traditional values, undermining civilization, promoting chaos. What are they projecting? Their own doubts about tradition, their own desire for change, their own rebellion against authority that's been suppressed for years. Liberals see conservatives as racist, sexist, authoritarian, clinging to the past. What are they projecting? Their own prejudices. They can't admit their own desires for security and order their own unconscious biases. Both sides have convinced themselves they're the force of good against evil. Neither can see that they're two halves of a whole psyche, each carrying shadow material for the other. Jung warned about exactly this. Democracy requires conscious citizens who can withdraw their projections. When populations operate from unconscious shadow projection, they become susceptible to demagogues who promise to destroy the scapegoat. Famous people serve a function in collective psyche. They carry our projections. We build them up as heroes, then destroy them when they reveal their shadows. The pattern is predictable. Discovery, adulation, revelation of flaws, destruction. We find someone talented or beautiful or inspiring. We project all our positive shadow onto them, everything we wish we could be. They become larger than human. Then evidence emerges of their humanity. They make mistakes. They reveal character flaws. They fail to live up to the projection. And we turn on them with fury proportional to our earlier adulation. This isn't about them. It's about us. We're enacting an ancient ritual building up the king, then sacrificing the king. The celebrity becomes the scapegoat carrying our collective shadow, and their destruction serves as release of our collective guilt. The famous person can't win. If they try to maintain the perfect image, they're fake. If they show their flaws, they've betrayed us. The only solution is recognizing that we're projecting that the pedestal we build is also the platform for sacrifice. Mainstream therapy culture has popularized psychological concepts while often missing their depth. Healing becomes a commodity. Self-care becomes shopping. Boundaries becomes selfishness justified. Social media therapists offer bite sized wisdom that often amounts to spiritual bypassing. Just accept yourself, release toxic people, choose happiness. These aren't wrong exactly, but they skip the difficult work Jung described. Real shadow integration isn't comfortable, it's not Instagrammable. It doesn't fit in a motivational quote over a sunset photo. It requires descending into what you'd rather avoid, facing what you'd rather deny, admitting what you'd rather keep hidden. The shadow of therapy culture is all the actual darkness being denied while we perform healing. All the judgment hidden under loving kindness language. All the narcissism disguised as self care. All the avoidance rationalized as boundaries. Toxic positivity is this shadow's clearest manifestation. The insistence that we must always be grateful, always look on the bright side, always focus on positives. This creates massive shadow containing all our legitimate anger, grief, despair, and rage about things that genuinely need to change. The person doing real shadow work isn't always positive. Sometimes they're angry. Sometimes they're depressed. Sometimes they acknowledge that things are genuinely bad and that accepting them would be betrayal of themselves. This isn't failure of shadow work. It's evidence of shadow work actually happening. We've spiraled through millennia now, seeing how the shadow wears different masks in different eras, but remains essentially the same. From Greek gods to Christian theology, to fairy tales, to modern literature, to symbolic systems, to contemporary culture, the pattern persists. You contain all of these patterns. The Apollo-Dionysus split, the Christ-Satan polarity, Snow White and her queen, Jekyll and Hyde, the devil in chains you could remove, the tower waiting to fall, the moon's deceptive light showing you your own projections. These aren't just interesting stories, they're maps of psychological territory you carry within you. The question isn't whether you have shadow material, everyone does. The question is whether you'll face it or continue projecting it. As we prepare to move from the mythological layer to the scientific layer, let this settle in you. You are the sum of all these archetypes. Ancient patterns are operating through your modern life. The same mechanisms that drove Greek tragedy are driving your relationship patterns. The same split that haunted medieval Christianity is creating your symptoms. This is psychology for sleep that whispers, you are living myths you don't even know you're enacting. The stories aren't past, they're present. They're you. Now we descend another level from the timeless archetypes to their manifestation. In time, in brain chemistry, developmental stages, research studies. From the eternal patterns to their temporal expressions in flesh and neurons. The shadow waits in the laboratory as surely as it waits in myth. As we transition from the archetypal realm to the empirical, we enter territory where Jung's intuitions have been tested, measured, and largely validated by modern research. This is psychology for sleep grounded in data, in studies in the messy business of trying to quantify what Jung discovered through introspection. Contemporary psychology approaches shadow through multiple frameworks, each offering different vocabulary for the same essential phenomenon. Cognitive psychology speaks of disowned self aspects, qualities that exist in your behavioral repertoire but have been split from conscious self-concept. These aren't unconscious in the sense of being inaccessible, but rather actively excluded from identity. You could acknowledge them if you chose to, but you don't choose to. Social psychology has documented projection bias, the tendency to assume others share our own thoughts, feelings, and beliefs more than they actually do. But the mechanism runs deeper than simple egocentric assumption. We specifically project disowned qualities. What we can't admit in ourselves, we see everywhere in others. Neuroscience locates shadow material in patterns of neural activation and suppression. Certain networks activate when confronting self-relevant threatening information that contradicts our self-concept. Other networks suppress that activation, maintaining the preferred self-image. The battle between these neural systems is shadow dynamics at the biological level. Clinical psychology refers to ego-dystonic material, thoughts, feelings, or impulses that feel alien to the conscious self that produce discomfort or anxiety. This contrasts with egocentric material that feels aligned with self-concept. The shadow is precisely the collection of ego-dystonic contents that consciousness rejects. Measurement of shadow has proven challenging because, by definition, shadow material resists conscious acknowledgement. You can't simply ask people, "What parts of yourself have you disowned?" and expect accurate answers. Researchers have developed clever methods. The implicit association test measures how quickly people associate certain concepts with self versus other. Faster associations suggest unconscious identification. Slower associations suggest conscious rejection. If you're slow to associate aggressive with me, but quick to associate it with others, aggression likely exists in your shadow. Q-sort methodology asks participants to arrange descriptive statements about themselves from most to least characteristic. Then researchers compare this actual self description to an ideal self description. The gap reveals disowned material qualities you possess, but wish you didn't. Projective tests like the Rorschach or TAT operate on the principle that, when presented with ambiguous stimuli, people project their own psychological content. What you see in the inkblot reveals what you're seeing, but not acknowledging in yourself. Modern neuroimaging allows researchers to observe brain activity during self-relevant processing. When participants are shown words describing negative traits and asked, "Does this describe you?" certain patterns emerge. For traits that exist but are denied shadow material, there's initial activation in areas associated with threat detection, followed quickly by activation in areas associated with inhibition and suppression. The brain recognizes the truth, then suppresses it. This happens in milliseconds beneath conscious awareness. The shadow is maintained actively constantly through neural mechanisms designed to protect self-concept from threatening information. Shadow differs from other psychological concepts in important ways. It's not the same as the Freudian unconscious, which contains content that's been completely repressed and is inaccessible without analysis. Shadow material is potentially accessible. It's just actively rejected. It's not the same as simple repression, which is a defense mechanism. Shadow is the result of repression accumulated over years, plus projection, plus identification with persona. It's a complex structure, not a single mechanism. And it's crucially different from psychopathic traits. The psychopath lacks conscience. Shadow is everything conscience has rejected. The psychopath has no guilt. Shadow contains all the guilt about being less than the idealized self. Shadow is quite specifically the collection of qualities you've split from conscious identity that retain energy and autonomy in the unconscious, that influence you through projection and symptom, and that could be integrated through conscious acknowledgement. This definition is precise enough for research, but flexible enough to account for individual variation in shadow content. Jung understood shadow as developmental. It forms over time, through interaction with environment and culture. Modern developmental psychology has traced this formation with remarkable precision. Let your consciousness drift through these stages as we explore how shadow accumulates from birth to death. The shadow begins forming the moment a child first hears no or don't, or good children don't do that. Research on toddlers shows that by age 2, they've already begun modifying behavior based on parental reactions. They learn which actions bring approval and which bring disapproval. This isn't inherently damaging. Socialization is necessary. Children need to learn that some behaviors are acceptable and others aren't. The problem arises when the message isn't about the behavior, but about the child's being. When "you did something bad" becomes "you are bad." Studies of children ages 3 to 5 show dramatic increases in self-conscious emotions, shame, guilt, embarrassment. These emotions serve to enforce social norms by creating internal discomfort when norms are violated. But they also begin the splitting process. The child learns certain parts of me are acceptable, certain parts are not. Attachment theory provides crucial insights. Children with secure attachment can express a full range of emotions and have them validated by caregivers. The securely attached child can be angry, sad, frightened, joyful, and receive attuned responses. This doesn't prevent shadow formation entirely, but it minimizes it. Children with insecure attachment, anxious or avoidant, learn that certain emotions threaten the attachment bond. The anxiously attached child might learn that anger pushes the parent away, so anger gets suppressed. The avoidantly attached child might learn that expressing need brings rejection, so dependency gets suppressed. These early suppressions form the foundation of shadow. By age 7, most children have developed a clear sense of good me versus bad me. The bad me isn't necessarily eliminated, just hidden from parental and social view. Entry into school intensifies shadow formation through peer interaction. Research shows that this developmental stage involves dramatic increases in social comparison and self-consciousness. Children become acutely aware of how they're perceived by peers. Gender socialization becomes explicit and rigid during these years. Boys learn that certain behaviors are for girls, showing emotion, being nurturing, being gentle. These qualities get suppressed, split off, pushed into shadow. Girls learn that certain behaviors are for boys, being aggressive, being competitive, being loud. These qualities similarly get exiled. Studies of elementary school children show remarkable conformity to gender norms compared to preschoolers. This isn't biological maturation. It's social pressure creating shadow. The boy who enjoyed playing with dolls at age 5 has learned by age 8 that this isn't acceptable. The quality doesn't disappear, it goes underground. Academic tracking also creates shadow material. Children designated as good at math begin to split off their creative, intuitive qualities. Children designated as artistic split off their logical analytical qualities. The identity formed around one set of qualities necessarily shadows the opposite qualities. Longitudinal studies show that this age period marks significant decreases in creative thinking and increases in conformity. Children become less willing to express unconventional ideas, less likely to question authority, more focused on getting approval. Each act of conformity adds to the shadow. Adolescence brings massive reorganization of identity and corresponding expansion of shadow. The emergence of sexuality alone creates enormous shadow material in cultures that shame or suppress sexual feelings. Research on adolescent development shows this period involves intense self-consciousness, concern with peer approval, formation of identity, through differentiation from parents. Each of these processes creates shadow. Moral foundations become rigid during adolescence. Studies using moral foundations theory show that teens develop strong in-group loyalty and out-group derogation. They define themselves through opposition. I'm not like them. This necessary identity formation simultaneously creates projection. They are what I refuse to be. Attachment to peer groups reaches its peak. The pressure to conform to group norms is stronger in adolescence than any other life stage. Longitudinal research shows that individuality often decreases during teen years, not increases, despite cultural mythology about teenage rebellion. The unlived life accumulates rapidly. The adolescent passionate about music, who's pushed toward medicine. The teen attracted to same-sex peers in a homophobic environment. The young person with unconventional political views in a conventional family. Each instance of denying authentic impulses to maintain belonging adds weight to the shadow. Teen social media use amplifies these processes. The curated online persona creates larger shadow by increasing the gap between presented self and actual experience. The constant comparison with others intensifies projection. The feedback loops of likes and comments strengthen attachment to false self. The persona solidifies in early adulthood around career and relationship roles. You become the professional, the spouse, the parent. Each role has behavioral expectations that create shadow. Career choice particularly generates shadow material. The corporate professional must suppress spontaneity and creativity to succeed in structured environments. The artist must suppress practical business skills to maintain artistic identity. The helper professional must suppress selfishness and boundaries to appear caring. Studies of personality across the lifespan show that traits appear to stabilize in the 30s. People become more themselves, which sounds positive, but often means more rigid, more defended, less open to shadow integration. The unlived life becomes more firmly unlived. Research on adult development reveals that this period often involves sacrificing authentic self for achievement or security. People make Faustian bargains. I'll suppress these parts of myself to succeed. The shadow grows in direct proportion to success defined by others' standards. Relationship patterns crystallize. People tend to choose similar partners repeatedly, suggesting they're attracted to specific shadow projections. The person who keeps finding unavailable partners is seeking someone to carry their disowned need for independence. The person who keeps finding controlling partners is projecting their own disowned desire for control. The shadow at this life stage contains everything sacrificed for career, relationship, social acceptance. The wild younger self that had to be tamed. the creative impulses that had to be suppressed for practical work, the relationship possibilities that weren't chosen, the dreams that were abandoned. Jung described midlife as the period when the shadow demands recognition. Modern research has validated this extensively. The midlife crisis is often shadow eruption after decades of suppression. Studies on life satisfaction show a U curve higher in youth, declining through 30s and 40s, reaching lowest point around 45-50, then increasing again in later years. This nadir corresponds to shadow confrontation. Physiologically, hormone changes affect both men and women during this period. These biological shifts can loosen the ego's grip on persona, allowing shadow material to surface. The person who's been tightly controlled for decades might suddenly experience urges they thought they'd eliminated. Career dissatisfaction peaks. The person who sacrificed passion for security realizes the bargain isn't working. The shadow contains all the roads not taken, the possibilities not explored, the authentic self that was denied for someone else's vision of success. Relationship crisis is common. The marriage that worked when both partners were performing expected roles fails when shadow material emerges. One partner suddenly wants freedom after years of commitment. Another wants intimacy after years of distance. These aren't whims. They're shadow material, demand and integration. The crucial variable is whether the person uses this crisis for integration or attempts to suppress it again. Those who face their shadow during midlife, who acknowledge what's been denied, who allow transformation, emerge into the second half of life with greater wholeness. Those who resist, who have affairs but don't examine what the affairs represent, who change careers but bring the same patterns, simply recreate the crisis later. Research suggests that those who successfully navigate midlife shadow work show increased authenticity, decreased anxiety, greater life satisfaction, and improved relationships. But the work is difficult enough that many avoid it, leading to decades of missed opportunity for integration. Late life presents two paths: wisdom through shadow integration, or bitterness through continued denial. Research on aging and personality shows that older adults often demonstrate less projection, more acceptance, greater psychological complexity. They can hold paradox. They're less threatened by ambiguity. These are signs of shadow integration. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson identified the final life stage as ego integrity versus despair. Integrity comes from accepting your one and only life with all its choices and consequences. Despair comes from regretting what you didn't do, who you didn't become, what you denied. The elder who has integrated shadow can reflect on life, honestly acknowledging failures and successes, cruelty and kindness, wisdom and foolishness without being destroyed by the honest reckoning. They've become what Jung called the wise old man or wise old woman, archetype carriers of hard-won wisdom available to the next generation. The elder who hasn't integrated shadow becomes bitter. They project their unlived life onto younger generations. Kids these days don't understand hard work, projecting their own suppressed desire for ease. People are too emotional now, projecting their own suppressed feelings. The bitterness is proportional to the shadow material remaining unintegrated. Generativity, Erikson's term for contributing to the next generation, requires having faced your shadow. You can't guide others through territories you haven't explored yourself. The bitter elder offers warnings. The wise elder offers understanding. Research on late life regret finds the most common regrets aren't about what people did, but about what they didn't do. I wish I'd been more authentic. I wish I'd followed my passion. I wish I'd expressed my feelings. These are shadows speaking at life's end, cataloging what wasn't lived. The tragedy is that even at life's end, integration remains possible. The 80-year-old can still acknowledge what was denied, can still make peace with the unlived life, can still withdraw projections and see clearly. But many don't. They carry their shadows to the grave, never having fully lived. Modern neuroscience has begun mapping the neural correlates of shadow processes. While Jung worked at the psychological level, contemporary researchers can observe what's happening in the brain during shadow activation and suppression. The amygdala functions as the brain's alarm system, detecting threats before conscious awareness processes them. This ancient structure evolved to identify environmental dangers, predators, poisonous foods, hostile tribe members. But it also responds to psychological threats, including threats to self-concept. When you encounter information that contradicts your self-image, the amygdala activates. Research using fMRI shows that seeing negative trait words that apply to you, but that you've denied, produces amygdala activation. The amygdala can't distinguish between physical and psychological threat. Being told you're selfish when you've built an identity around selflessness creates the same neural alarm as encountering a snake. The body prepares for fight or flight. Heart rate increases. Cortisol releases. Attention narrows. This explains why shadow confrontation feels dangerous. At the neural level, it is dangerous to the self-concept the brain has been protecting. Studies show that people with hyperactive amygdala responses show more resistance to shadow material. The stronger the threat response, the more rigid the defenses, the larger the shadow tends to be. Conversely, practices that reduce amygdala reactivity, meditation therapy. Certain medications can make shadow integration easier. The material becomes less threatening, more tolerable, more capable of being examined. The ACC specializes in detecting conflicts between competing neural representations. When your behavior contradicts your beliefs, the ACC signals this discrepancy. This is the neural basis of cognitive dissonance. Shadow material creates constant ACC activation because there's constant conflict between actual self and ideal self. Research shows that people with larger actual ideal self gaps show more ACC activity during self-relevant processing. The ACC's job is alerting you to the conflict. What happens next determines whether shadow integration occurs. If you acknowledge the discrepancy and adjust your self-concept to include the denied quality, the conflict resolves. If you rationalize project or deny the conflict, persists. Studies of ACC function reveal that some people have less active ACCs. They're less sensitive to internal conflicts. These individuals tend to show more projection and less self-awareness. They genuinely don't detect the conflicts between what they claim and what they do. This has implications for shadow work. People with underactive ACCs may need external feedback to notice shadow material because they're not internally detecting the conflicts. People with overactive ACCs may need help tolerating the discomfort of conflicts without immediately suppressing them. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex (MPFC), is involved in self-referential processing and integrating information about self. This region allows metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. Shadow integration requires robust prefrontal function. You need to be able to hold multiple representations of self simultaneously. Who you think you are, who you're afraid you are, who you're denying you are. Then you need to integrate these into a more complex, more accurate self-concept. Research shows that meditation strengthens prefrontal cortex. Long-term meditators show increased gray matter density in MPFC and increased connectivity between MPFC and other regions. This enhanced neural integration may explain why contemplative practices facilitate shadow work. Damage to prefrontal cortex conversely makes shadow integration nearly impossible. Patients with frontal lobe damage often show decreased self-awareness and increased projective tendencies. They can't maintain the self-observation necessary for integration. Developmental research reveals that prefrontal cortex isn't fully mature until the mid-20s. This explains why adolescents have difficulty with shadow integration. The neural hardware for complex self-reflection isn't completely online yet. The default mode network, DMN, becomes active during rest mind-wandering and self-referential thought. It's often called the self-network because it seems to generate and maintain the narrative sense of continuous self. The persona the social mask Jung described is maintained largely through DMN activity. The story you tell about yourself, the consistent self-image you maintain, the identity that feels continuous despite changing circumstances, all involve DMN. Shadow material threatens this narrative consistency. If you've constructed a self-story of being kind, evidence of your cruelty doesn't fit. The DMN works to maintain narrative coherence, which often means excluding contradictory evidence, pushing it into shadow. Research on psychedelics has shown that compounds like psilocybin temporarily disrupt DMN function. During the experience, the rigid self-story loosens. People report ego death, the sense that their familiar self-identity has dissolved. Interestingly, these experiences often allow access to shadow material that was previously defended against. The DMN's disruption may explain why psychedelic-assisted therapy shows promise for conditions involving rigid self-concepts. When the self-story temporarily dissolves, material from the shadow can emerge and be integrated before the narrative reconsolidates. However, DMN disruption without integration support can be destabilizing. The person has access to shadow material, but no framework for making sense of it. This is why therapeutic container matters enormously in shadow work. Studies show that people with more flexible DMNs, who can move more easily between self-focused and non-self-focused states, tend to have more accurate self-knowledge and less projection. Rigid DMN activity correlates with rigid self-concept, which correlates with larger shadow. Various neurotransmitter systems influence shadow formation and integration. Serotonin affects mood regulation and self-perception. Low serotonin correlates with increased negative self-focus and rumination. But interestingly, low serotonin may also increase access to shadow material. The person isn't maintaining the defensive positivity that keeps shadow suppressed. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, increase serotonin levels, which often reduces anxiety and depression. But some people report that SSRIs make them feel flattened, less access to the full range of emotion, including important shadow material. The medication reduces the stress, but may also reduce the motivation to do shadow work. Because the conflict doesn't feel as urgent, dopamine regulates reward and motivation. The brain's reward system gets hijacked by persona maintenance. Social approval, likes, praise status, activates dopamine pathways. This reinforces the false self because maintaining the persona becomes literally rewarding at the neurochemical level. Shadow integration initially reduces dopamine. Acknowledging disowned qualities doesn't feel rewarding. It feels threatening. You lose the dopamine hit of social approval when you stop performing the persona. This is why shadow work is difficult. You're fighting your own reward system. Long term, however, authenticity becomes rewarding. Research on well-being shows that people who live more congruently with their values report greater life satisfaction. The dopamine system can recalibrate to reward authenticity instead of performance. But this requires sustained effort through the initial discomfort. Cortisol. The stress hormone remains chronically elevated when living as a false self. The body registers the constant vigilance required to maintain persona, the suppression of authentic impulses, the performance of behaviors that don't feel genuine. This shows up as elevated baseline cortisol. Studies of authenticity and physiological stress reveal that people who report larger gaps between true self and presented self show higher cortisol levels, more inflammation markers, and poorer immune function. The shadow creates not just psychological, but physical stress. Shadow work initially increases cortisol. Facing what you've been avoiding is stressful. But successful integration decreases baseline cortisol over time. The body relaxes when you stop fighting yourself. Now we examine specific research findings that support Jung's shadow model. This is psychology for sleep, grounded in data, in studies conducted across decades, in patterns that emerge when you actually test these ideas empirically. Perhaps the most famous demonstration of shadow at work is the Dunning-Kruger effect, first described by David Dunning and Justin Kruger at Cornell University in 1999. They found that incompetent people dramatically overestimate their own ability. People scoring in the bottom quartile on tests of logic, grammar, or humor rated themselves as above average. The less skilled they were, the more confident they were in their skills. Why? Because the same skills needed to be competent are needed to recognize incompetence. If you don't know logic well, you can't recognize flawed logic in your own thinking. Your ignorance exists in your shadow. You literally can't see what you don't know. This connects directly to Jung's insight that we can't recognize what we don't possess. The logically incompetent person can't see their logical flaws because logic itself is in their shadow. They've split it off from self-concept, probably through years of avoiding activities that challenged them logically. Conversely, Dunning and Kruger found that highly competent people slightly underestimate their abilities. They can see flaws in their work that others can't because they have the skills to recognize the flaws. Their competence allows realistic self-assessment. The shadow implication: the more convinced you are that you lack shadow material in a particular domain, the more likely that domain is shadowed. The person absolutely certain they're not racist, probably hasn't examined their unconscious biases. The person absolutely certain they're kind probably hasn't acknowledged their capacity for cruelty. Metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, requires acknowledging limitations. Shadow material resists acknowledgement. Therefore, the largest shadows exist precisely where we're